This week, we're revisiting how to remove noise from your podcast because, honestly, last week, I didn't do such a good job. Also, we're discussing one of the seminal works of modern fantasy. Often criticized and misunderstood, it's the work of one of my literary heroes on the new adventures of Indiana Jim for the week of August 24th, 2025.
Coming to you not exactly live from
the cliffs of insanity!
It must be Indiana Jim.
Yes, we're back, and boy, do I have a blistering review of my own content from last week. You know, I wanted to come on and talk to you about this wonderful app I discovered called Hush on the Macintosh computer. And I didn't do such a good job. No, I did a terrible job presenting Hush to you because of something very critical to getting a good result out of any effect that you use. From even from your preamp, from the microphone. So one of the rules of live sound, which I've done professionally in the past, is that you're only as good as your source. There is no sound man that can make a bad band sound good. Now, a good sound engineer can make up for or cover up certain frequencies, certain noises, add some compression, kill some troublesome frequencies, that kind of thing. They can make it sound better. But if it sounds bad, they can't make it sound good. So you're only as good as your source. And I went looking at my source from last week. In fact, let's bring this up. Hey everybody, Editing Jim here, and this is the 8th time I've tried to record this bit. But you will notice something in my audio that sounds a lot like digital artifacting, but in fact it's not. A few months ago I had to have all my upper teeth taken out, and I'm wearing a full denture, and so I'm learning how to talk again. And one of the keys is slowing down, but one of the other things is there's a way the air breaks across the roof of the mouth when you're wearing these that kind of breaks up the air. So when I say a word like difficulty, I'm having difficulty getting those continents? Yeah, that's it. Getting those consonants to come out clearly. And so it sounds kind of funny, especially in that intro. So I hope that you'll continue to bear with me as I learn to do this again. And this is completely unprocessed, so what you're hearing is what it sounds like through this microphone without any processing whatsoever. So again, I hope you'll bear with me, and I will now return you to your regularly scheduled programming. You can see here I've added a new source, a new scene to our presentation here. You can now see the desktop that I'm working on. I've got my MacBook here. I've got display here. I've got OBS over here so I can watch what I'm doing, but I need to make sure that I'm not paying attention to OBS. So I don't want to do this because that messes up and it messes up everything, and I'll explain here in a minute. But let me get in here to, I think it was this one. Okay, so here we have my DaVinci Resolve window. And I have the audio file from what I posted last time. But as you can tell looking at this waveform, it's not very good. I can't really show you my GarageBand waveform. Let me see if you can even see anything on this. But you can't really see the way, but you can see how it's filling in more space in there. We're getting what we call less headroom. So the gap between your waveform and the top of your track shows you how many decibels you have before you clip, and this is called headroom. So what you have is the ability to amplify signals and tamp down signals, and this is a concept called, and most of you probably know this already if you're listening to this show or watching on YouTube. And if you are watching on YouTube, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more video content to come. Signal to noise ratio. What that means is the more signal you have compared to the amount of noise you have, the better. So if I'm speaking very quietly in a very noisy room, you don't hear me as well. That's why when you are in a crowded space or in a concert, you have to increase your voice for the person beside you or in front of you to hear you. You have to increase your signal to noise ratio. So if you have this little bit of noise and a slightly bigger waveform, you're asking for trouble. What you want is a nice full waveform with a little bit of headroom to that same noise level. If you have a little bitty noise level, but your signal is this big, then you want way more signal to the amount of noise that you have. You want 80-20 probably is a good ratio to aim for, let's say. So what happened in last week's episode when I pointed out, and if you watch this on the video, I put subtitles because I discovered this in the ending, but there was this strange artifact sound after applying hush. And I thought a few different things. Number one, was the file too big? Was I asking hush to process too much? Did it go on too long? But it would happen periodically, and it wasn't a regular rate, so that wasn't the problem. And then I wondered, I wonder if the digital effects, let me try recording it without the effects applied, process the effects in post, and see if that makes a difference. But then I realized something when I opened this up, and I discovered my waveform was really small. In fact, when I play it, let me back up here. Let me back up to this spot here. Was based on, you can see in the meters up here, which was and then even the meter down here, that they use. It's not very loud at all. The people at Shure said. So I paid special attention to these meters up here, and this is something I discovered from a guy named Daniel Batal on YouTube, and I'll put a link to him. He has a series of shorts called DaVinci Resolve for Noobs, and he pointed out there's a LUFS meter, because it instantly brought to mind, I'm not getting enough LUFS. When I was listening to the podcast that came before mine as I was at work, when it got to mine, I was like, I have to really crank it. I'm like, I'm not getting a strong level here. That's what made me go back and look at this. And so up there, and I don't know that I can zoom in here. Let me, so if you look at that, you can see control room level, bus 1 level, and loudness in LUFS. But we want you, and you can click on this thing and set it to YouTube. But you can see, like a good broadcast microphone. What am I hitting here? They gave it a thinner diaphragm to make it more sensitive. Minus 32. They have a tighter. So right here, when you hit start, it measures the maximum LUFS that you're getting. And LUFS is a way of measuring loudness units, right? Loudness units full scale, I think is what it means. What we want is to hit minus 14. Engineered in such a way. That's the loudness standard for YouTube. So I cranked that fader all the way up. Deeper voices would sound good on the radio, where it would capture the life of those announcer voices. That's why it had the resonant chamber, to capture more of the low end, the original SM7. So now we've hit a better rate. We've hit minus 16. We want to aim for as close to minus 14 as we can. And that's to basically indicate a comfortable listening level on YouTube. There is a standard. So if you're making a podcast or you're making YouTube videos and you want to make sure that you have a good, strong signal with what you want, people who are listening on their headphones to have headroom. If they got to crank it all the way up just to get your audio at a reasonable listenable level, they can't increase it. If their environment noise gets louder, they can only decrease it. So you want to give them some headroom so they can increase that as necessary. And so wherever you're posting to, and YouTube is a good, reasonable standard to follow. It's like the standard in radio broadcasting. You want your signal to have reach a certain level so that it's easy to amplify. You don't have to work as hard to apply effects. And so what happens is that with my signal so low compared to my noise level, well, when Hush goes in to process that signal, it has a hard time determining, is this noise that I need to reduce or eliminate? Or is this signal that I need to allow to come through? And so that's what contributes to those artifacts, is that low signal to noise ratio. So in your effort as a content creator, if you are aiming to get at least 1% better every time, pay attention to this, because no amount of noise reduction is going to work right if you're not giving a good initial signal. And remember, you're only as good as your signal. I just bumped this thing, but that's why a bad microphone won't sound good in a $50,000 recording studio. A bad singer isn't going to sound good in a $50,000 recording studio. A beautiful mic in a terrible preamp is not going to sound good. So you really need to be considering your source. You need to be looking at these things. You need to be focused on the details and always strive to get at least 1% better. So now we're back with our bright white screen. And once more with the scene 3. So this is where I get the majority of my front light. I don't turn this at me because that's awful. And that's just for you YouTube viewers. But so what we're talking about, I mentioned that I'm talking about one of the seminal works of modern fantasy, often criticized, often misunderstood. But this is the guy, more than Tolkien, this is the guy that inspired me to write my own fantasy novels. And I found this book, and if you follow me on the X platform at Indiana Jim, you will have already seen this. Found this book at Ollie's, Origins of the Wheel of Time by Michael Livingston. And, the Wheel of Time, as I say, is often criticized. One of the pull quotes that is on all the covers, or all the paperback covers of the Wheel of Time, is from a New York Times review that says, "Jordan has come to dominate the world Tolkien began to reveal." And one of the major criticisms, one of the first major criticisms, is that, it's just a pastiche of Tolkien. It's just a bunch of tropes. It's so tropey. And you, in a vacuum, you might be right. In 2025, you might be right. However, what are the tropes that Robert Jordan relied upon? You see, he was looking, and one of the things you'll discover if you read this book, now I got it at Ollie's for like $3.59 or something. It's not super thick. So unlike The Wheel of Time, this is a fairly thin book, but it's broken up into 2 parts. And let's just look at this real quick. So, a brief biography of James Oliver Rigney, Robert Jordan. A chapter on Tolkien and Jordan. And then another chapter on how Jordan constructed, or how Robert Jordan constructed the Wheel of Time saga. Then you have this whole section of a glossary of characters and places and events and things and where they come from in the real world. So you may think, the White Tower. He's just talking about Minas Tirith, right? He's just taken Minas Tirith from The Lord of the Rings. Well, no, actually, he was taking the White Tower from the Citadel, where he went to school, the military academy. So there are a lot of things where it's a misunderstanding of where Jordan is getting things from. There are people like characters like historical characters like Arthur Hawkwing, right? Clearly, we're getting a King Arthur sort of thing. So there's a couple things. There's a great quote on the back, and I'm not sure. I swear I saw it when I was reading the book, but I skimmed through here, and I can't find it. So it's this quote: "The most central truth of Jordan's fantasy is that it's built out of a great many of our own myths and legends. King Arthur is in the Wheel of Time, Merlin too. But so are Alexander the Great and the Apollo program, the Norse gods and Napoleon's greatest victory. It's astonishing how much is in these books." And what he does is go to great lengths to show that. But there's a passage in here. He talks about how Tolkien draws on ancient myths and legends, and basically Jordan does a similar thing. This passage here: "Jordan's Arthur Pendrag, Paendrag, is our King Arthur, son of Uther Pendragon. The Sa'angreal in his books have clear roots in the stories of the Holy Grail. The Dark One, Shaitan, is related to Satan. The Samael is based in part on the Talmudic Angel of Death. The final battle of Tarmon Gaiadon owes more than just its name to biblical Armageddon. Luz Theron echoes the light bearer Lucifer." The list could go on and on. And so in a lot of ways, you can look at that and go, oh, Jordan's just making stuff up that sounds like things from mythology. And yes, but in a way, as Tolkien was devising a mythology for England, Jordan was devising a mythology kind of for the world. And listen, you know, you don't have to like it. And that's the other thing, is not everybody's tastes runs the same way. When The Eye of the World came out, it was 1990, 1991, somewhere in that area. So, you know, it's, how old am I? So I was 13 and 48 now. So 35 years ago is when the first book came out. So obviously it harkens back to a different time and a different marketing in the genre. You know, back then you could still walk into a B. Dalton's in the mall, and you can't do that anymore. And back then, really the only big series that you could read was either The Wheel of Time or The Sword of Truth, Terry Goodkind. Or you could get into the Shannara series by Terry Brooks. Terry Brooks came out with A Sword of Shannara in 1977. And that was as Lester Del Rey was trying to feed off of the success of The Lord of the Rings. The popularity of The Lord of the Rings had resurged. And so when you go back and read The Sword of Shannara, it is way more evocative of Tolkien than Robert Jordan could ever dream of being. But there's so many different things that go into The Wheel of Time, and a lot more things that come from Eastern influences, Asian influences. A lot of the things that Jordan saw and was familiar with because of his time in Vietnam is in there, whereas Tolkien's experience came from World War I and being a citizen during the rise of Nazi Germany. So when you really dive into the Wheel of Time, and you dive into this book, Origins of the Wheel of Time, you gain a better understanding, a better appreciation of where Jordan was coming from when he was writing the books. Now, let's talk about the experience of actually reading the books, because when I first picked it up, I had just read The Lord of the Rings, I think. it might have been even later because I was 21 when I got married in 98. So it would have been 99. It would have been early 1999 in the run up to the Lord of the Rings films that were coming out. I picked up the Lord of the Rings, the entire volume, not the 3 separate books, but the entire single book in a larger paperback volume. And I remember loving it, obviously. But when I was finished, I said to myself, I want a series that I can really sink my teeth into. And I remember exactly when this was, when I started reading The Wheel of Time. My wife and I were on a trip to Cleveland, Ohio, and it's about a 5-hour drive from where we are in Indiana, to see John Williams conducting the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra. And my wife was very pregnant at the time. And she was pregnant with our second child, our son, who is named after John Williams. His name is Towner, after John Towner Williams. And as we're in the mall, I forget whether it was in Cleveland or near there or somewhere, we're at the mall nearby looking for something where, need something to occupy our time until the concert. And it was Sunday. We had gone to Parkside Church, where Alistair Begg was the pastor there. And then after that, we went to lunch, and we were in town there in Chagrin Falls or wherever it was, and there's a mall, and we'll go check it out. And we go into the Walden Books. It was another mall bookstore you can no longer go into. But I said to myself, I want to get into one of these really long fantasy series. So that's number one. You have to want something. You have to want a sprawling epic. And Wheel of Time books had their marketing placement, and they were obviously very popular at the time. And we were about 9 or 10 books in. We hadn't quite got to, I think we got through Winter's Heart. I don't think Crossroads of Twilight was out yet. I think Crossroads of Twilight was the first one that I was excited to get to. So I picked up The Eye of the World there in Cleveland, Ohio. And I started reading that thing that night after the concert. Was just thoroughly engrossed. Now, immediately upon starting The Eye of the World, I could easily see all of the Tolkien references, but I was kind of confused about why are we combining trolls and orcs into Trollocs? Like, why? Where does that come from? But what I did was I told myself, I'm in for a penny, in for a pound, right? I am ready to be entertained. I am ready to be led on a merry chase. I'm ready to be led on a merry chase across all of these books. And that's what I was looking for, a very long fantasy series. I still wasn't quite aware of the fact that an author could pass away before finishing his masterwork. That was something that I just didn't have a concept of, right? It's just this guy writes these huge door stoppers, and that's all I know. I know what I'm getting into as far as length of time commitment, because there were 9 books out. I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is going to be incredible. And I don't really know what it is. I guess it was the familiarity with Tolkien that drew me to The Eye of the World and not Terry Goodkind. It just really felt more like Robert Jordan was more my speed, I think, from reading it. Even though I did end up reading The Sword of Truth, and liked it, and I just didn't like much of that came after. But I was in love with The Wheel of Time. And I knew when I was reading it, I was in the hands of a capable storyteller. Now, there are people who will tell you that when you get to book 5 and 6 and 7, that the series just is a slog, right? And in one sense, I agree. They really did take time, and there wasn't as much action, but there was a lot more intrigue. And what I realized was that Robert Jordan is telling a story that is affected by and covers nations, countries, entire individual cultures. The main character has to build alliances with entire nation states, and these things don't just happen overnight. We are building a sprawling epic. We are building a War of the Roses type of thing, only a little bit different. It's not the many different kingdoms and kings fighting against each other, but the one man trying to unite multiple kingdoms together in one cause. This is how does the king of Gondor build political alliances with, instead of building a political alliance with Rohan and who else? There's no major armies that Aragorn has to build an alliance with. But Rand al'Thor, he's got so many different countries that he has to build alliances with. Not only that, but then he has to deal with an invading army from across the sea. So not only does he have to build alliances with the nations of the Westlands to unite them in the last battle against the Dark One, here comes the Shan Chan with their own ideas of how to fight the Dark One. So Rand has to unite nations against the Shan Chan and then turn them to his will to use them to fight against the Dark One in the last battle. There's all these political, sociological things. And then the Shan Chan believe that all people who can channel should be slaves. The ladies of the White Tower, the Aes Sedai, believe that all men who channel go insane, and therefore you have all these built-in biases and prejudices that all these different groups of people have. And Rand has to manage all of that. That takes time to build all that. And those books that people say are a slog. Now, I get it if it's not to your taste, but you do have to be aware of how much time the author is taking to build all of these things up to get to the point we need to get to. And people will, the cynics will be like, "Oh, he was just padding his word count to sell more books." And that's just not the case. It might feel like you don't know where things are going in book 5 or 6 or whatever. You might be at the point where I don't know what he's building up to. I thought it was this, but we're going off to here and I don't understand. And that's the point, is that you don't understand. And I didn't understand either, but my perspective was, I'm going to trust that the author at least knows where he's getting to. And it's like J.R.R. Tolkien. He thought he was going to write one novel as a sequel to The Hobbit, but he said himself that the tale grew in the telling. But nobody was sitting there, Tolkien didn't write 12 novels. He wrote one. Well, he wrote 2, The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings, and then The Silmarillion was compiled later. But he really wrote one long novel. And if you want something that's a little tighter, you want a trilogy, well, read a trilogy, and that's fine. But what you'll find is in a trilogy, it may be epic in scope, but the narrative is going to be compressed to something a little more targeted, a little more specific. So the length that you need to tell your story depends on the scale of everything that's involved. And the scale of everything involved in Jordan's work is far larger than the scale of what's involved in The Lord of the Rings. The central conflict of The Lord of the Rings is get the ring to Mount Doom. Everything else is trying to save the world of men and then trying to distract the Eye of Sauron so that the hobbits can do their thing. So you have to kind of understand the scope of things. And the scope of Jordan's work is also many different point of view characters. And so what happens is when you get into something like this, you go, okay, I feel like it's going to take this long. I think I can get this done in 6 books, I think is originally what Jordan thought. And of course, as he's telling the story, things pop up and things happen, and the tale grew in the telling. When I started my fantasy series with The First Blade, when I wrote that, I had a plan in my head and on paper. I had a detailed outline for the first novel, a shorter outline for book 2, and a basic premise for book 3. Wasn't even fleshed out. By the time I finished the first book, which more or less follows the outline fairly closely, I realized that the outline for book 2 doesn't work. This story is no longer this. And so where do I need to go? So I tried a few different things. I started one that was 3 years in the future. I started one that was 5 years in the future. I started one that was 10 years in the future. And well, I started scenes that I realized were set in different time frames. I wrote 92,000 words plus of the wrong novel before I realized it was the wrong novel. So I went back and looked at it and realized, holy crap, book 2 needs to start right at the end of book 1. Like we need to roll from the end in book 1 to here's what came immediately after. The shouts of the people at the finale of the book are still echoing in the ears of the main character or one of the point of view characters when we start book 2. That's how right on the dot it starts. Because I realized that we need to see what happens to the hero on screen. Take that, J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson. We need to see the hero get to the point that we need him to be in this future event. There's a process to this. We need to see the journey of this character. We need to see it happen on screen so we really understand what's happening. To make everything make sense, and not just for the hero, to make everything make sense in the world building, we have to see it happen. And I tried to get to a point where everything was one way, and then the sequel, everything's gone to crap, and we need to bring back the long lost hero to fix everything. And I just realized it wasn't going to work that way. I hadn't done enough of the groundwork. And this, I think, is what's most often misunderstood about Robert Jordan's work. And again, may not be to your taste, and that's okay. That really is okay. If you read through a few books and you didn't like it, fine. You know, I'm certainly not going to criticize anybody about that or for that. You know what you like and you know what you want. And if it doesn't meet what you want, if it doesn't meet your expectations, then it's not for you. However, there are people like me who is looking for exactly that. The other criticism, and this one is fair. Robert Jordan has his quirks as a writer. He has his patterns. Let's take everyone's favorite Aes Sedai to criticize, and that's Nynaeve Almira. God bless her, Nynaeve. She spends a lot of time yanking her braids, and her hair is braided, and it's a long braid. And she has this nervous tick. And she has a habit of yanking on that braid. And she does it a lot. And so there is a line, I think, between understanding that a character has habits. It's like they say that, You want to describe a character so well that you don't have to name them for the reader to recognize who you're talking about. So when you see a woman yanking on her braid, that's Nynaeve, you know? When somebody says blood and bloody ashes, you know it's Matt Cawthon. And so each of these characters has their personality traits. They have their personality quirks, and they have their foibles, and they have their common phrases, and they have their common actions. And Jordan spends so much time using those that he kind of overdoes it a little bit. And he also loves describing clothes, and he loves describing food. Now, he doesn't describe food to the level that George R.R. Martin describes food. That dude, and you can tell he loves to eat. You can tell George loves to eat because he spends so much time talking about the food. Now, when I'm writing, I don't spend as much time talking about the food because it makes me hungry. I don't want to write on an empty stomach, and I don't want to feel like I have to eat. Jordan loves his clothing. One of those things, though, comes from his love of history and his love of the Victorian era and the colonial American era. You know, he lived in South Carolina. You know, that's his home. And that was Harriet's home. And one of the earlier things he wrote before he wrote The Wheel of Time was the Fallon series, the Fallon Blood. And that takes place in Charleston, South Carolina during the Revolutionary War. And so Robert Jordan he really loves brocaded silk. Like, he has a problem. He has an addiction to brocaded silk. But because of his propensity to describe things in vivid detail, you know what a Shienaran warrior looks like. You don't have to have them described anymore. When you get to the last battle and you see the Shienarans with their shining spears and their halberds, move into position, you know what they look like as a group as they're moving into position. Robert Jordan was an expert at setting a stage, at setting an image so vividly in your mind that you can see it happening in front of you without description. That, I think, made it a lot easier for Brandon Sanderson to get into the last 3 books because, and Sanderson also known for his description, but there is a brevity to Sanderson's prose where he doesn't rely so much on all of the extensive description because there's so much happening in those last 3 books after Knife of Dreams. And this is one of, if you've never went through the Wheel of Time, but you think you'd like to, I say do it. Go into it understanding what to expect. And you should expect a little bit of a slog in the middle books. That's why they call it a muddy middle. Now, if you can accept that and understand that he's painting a picture that will pay off down the road, and it will pay off down the road. He spent extensive time as he was dealing with his illness making notes and dictating things to his staff and his wife, who was his editor. That there was so much stuff for Brandon Sanderson to use. And it's just such an interesting scenario. It was really neat to see a guy who knew he was going to pass away, who ended up realizing, I'm not going to be able to finish it, but somebody should. And I think he felt like he owed it to the fans who had read his books, who had gone through the slog, who had endured the slow points. I think he felt like he owed it to all of his readers to see that it was finished. And he entrusted Harriet with finding somebody who could finish it. And having read Mistborn and the initial Mistborn trilogy, it's clear to me now why Harriet, when she first laid eyes on Mistborn, how she knew this was the guy to finish this. This is a guy with an understanding of scale, of description, of world building, of mythology, that he was the perfect guy to take it on. And he does so absolutely brilliantly. The last 3 books, you can't tell where Robert Jordan ends and Brandon Sanderson begins. It feels like Robert Jordan, but it feels like Robert Jordan with fresh legs. And the last 3 books, everything, it's like Brandon got to write 3 books of a Sanderlanche with as many things that coalesce and come together to finish the series. And the ending is one of the most interesting, like bittersweet, but more sweet than bitter. And the implications that are paid off, but the twist of how he pays it off, how he resolves it, and how he leaves things open to the imagination. And he closes many doors, but he opens a window that is really interesting. And man, the fan fiction out of that, I'm sure is great. I haven't looked at it, but I'm sure is wonderful. um, but Robert Jordan to me is, I don't want to say he's my chief literary hero, but he may be. Like, I feel like Tolkien really is the top dog there, but Robert Jordan comes in absolutely right on his heels. And now there's other authors that I really like that inspire me. Glenn Cook is one. He wrote the Chronicles of the Black Company. Michael Crichton is another. Tom Clancy, Clive Cussler. In fact, the 3 C's were they informed my voice, my author voice. Joe Abercrombie is probably closest to the voice that I aim for. Not as much as the grimdark. I like to call myself Joe Abersofty. So I like to be a little gritty, and I like to have a sense of humor, but I'm not quite as graphically violent, and I'm not quite as vulgar, if you could even call it that at all. I don't like to use language in my books. So so in that case, I'm more like Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. The scope of the Wheel of Time is kind of like the MCU, building up this world, building up these characters, so that by the time you get to the last Infinity War movies, everything makes sense, to build up to this emotional climax of the final battle against Thanos. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about with the Wheel of Time. That's the kind of thing that Robert Jordan did, that even though, just like the MCU, there's middle movies that aren't as good, that are maybe kind of a slog, that maybe aren't as entertaining as some of the other ones, but there's still stuff in there that is used in later films. In the same way, The Wheel of Time is this sprawling epic saga that you'll like some books better than others. You won't like every book the same. But there are books in there that are really, really good. And, The Great Hunt feels more like a medieval Robin Hood sort of story, whereas The Shadow Rising feels like a Western. Robert Jordan wrote Westerns too, and he wrote Conan. I just wanted to get on and talk about Robert Jordan because not only because I picked this book and it brought to mind the experience of reading through the series, but I also wanted to clarify some things and bring up that while he is often criticized, and sometimes fairly, I feel like he's misunderstood more than he ought to be. And I think that it's real popular now to have a hot take and to chime in with your soundbite and talk about Robert Jordan as tropey and put a period on it. But that doesn't cover everything. I think we need a return to nuance in our world. We need to return to having a discussion. And so that's what I want from you. If you would email me indianagym.podcasts@gmail.com if you want to write your thoughts down. If you want to send a voice memo or an audio file to that email address, please do so. If you are getting this via Substack and you want to leave a comment on the post for this episode, do that. It'll come straight to me. If you are watching on YouTube, please hit the like button. Hit subscribe if you'd like to receive more from me here, and drop a comment under the video and tell me your experience with Robert Jordan, your thoughts on Robert Jordan. Hopefully you've listened to my comments and you can relate it to the context of what I've actually said and not just chime in with a comment that shows that you didn't watch the video. If you would comment Purple Pimpernel to demonstrate that you watched the whole video, or just put pee-pee. Pee-pee. Anyway, that is going to do it from me. We're going to see what happens next week. Hopefully we'll find some news headlines that are really actually grabbing my interest, because right now the news is kind of dead for me as far as this part is concerned. But we'll see what happens. We'll see if anybody announces any new books or any new movies, or I one of the things I want to talk about is the potential for the reboot potential for the Indiana Jones property. I don't know. I don't know how much potential is there, but that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about down the road here. So we'll see what happens. But thanks for listening. You have chosen wisely. There are so many movies, from Iron Man to Avengers Endgame, that tell... can you hear my cat? I have to pet the cat because she has to talk to me. She doesn't like being held, so I'm not going to bring her up for the camera. She just needed a pet.